You might recall that a few months ago I published a video addressing the historical reasoning behind why I always wear my hat sideways when I'm wearing my British Redcoat impression. You might also recall that in that video I was wearing my leather accoutrements in a curious way, in that I was wearing the cartridge pouch over the bayonet belt, as opposed to the way that most reenactors commonly wear their belts, which is the opposite. The cartridge pouch usually goes on first, and then the bayonet goes over it. In fact, a few of you actually pointed that out to me, saying, "Hey, you're wearing your belting wrong. The cartridge pouch is supposed to go on before the bayonet, not after." And I'm actually really glad that some of you caught on to that, because, as you may have guessed, that's going to be the topic of today's video. What is the correct order for wearing the belting anyway? Well, strap yourselves in, because we're going to be analyzing some illustrations today. The first image that I am going to submit for your consideration is this sketch by Philip de Latherborg, whom you might remember because I also reference some of his sketches in the cocked hat video as well. Actually, I'm going to be showing a number of his works here, so get used to hearing his name. It's going to come up a lot. This first image is a sketch of a British grenadier circa 1778, which Latherborg drew during a visit to Warley Camp in Essex. He's standing with his musket at the recover, and we can clearly see that his cartridge pouch strap is being worn over the bayonet belt. And we have several more sketches of presumably this same gentleman, done at the same time, that show this much more clearly. Here's another one from the back, and another from a different angle just for good measure. Again, in all of these, you can clearly see that the pouch is being worn over the bayonet, but that's not all. Latherborg has other works which demonstrate this same configuration. This is a detail from one of his larger pieces, a painting titled The Mock Attack, which is an interesting piece in its own right, and to be honest, probably deserves an entirely separate video dedicated solely to it. It shows a large-scale tactical demonstration, which was held again at Warley Camp in October of 1778, specifically for the benefit of King George III. So, sort of a reenactment before reenactments were really a thing. Very cool. But for right now, I simply want to draw your attention to this battalion man in the lower right-hand corner of the frame. Again, note how his pouch is being worn over the bayonet belt. So already you might be sensing a pattern here, but everything that I have shown thus far has been by a single artist, and if it were only Latherborg who was illustrating the accoutrements being worn in this configuration, I'd be willing to chalk it up to him either making a mistake or exercising a bit of artistic license. But I'm not done yet. I have several more illustrations to show you that should demonstrate that this is no mere fluke. This is a close-up from a panorama of the countryside surrounding the city of Boston, illustrated circa 1775 by one Lieutenant Williams of the 23rd Regiment of Foot. Here we see a battalion company soldier, possibly on sentry duty, again wearing the pouch over the bayonet. Next we have one of the Minorca paintings by Giuseppe Chiesa, showing some grenadiers and battalion company men of the 25th Foot marching side by side, circa 1771. All are wearing their pouches over the bayonet. Next, we have a detail from a Paul Sandby sketch, circa 1780. The title of this piece is The Encampment at Blackheath. Some more battalion company soldiers, and again, same thing. And here we have a close-up from the death of Major Pearson, which you might recognize from Brandon F's latest video on grenadiers. The event being depicted here, which is the Battle of Jersey, occurred in 1781, but the painting was made in 1783 by John Singleton Copley. And again, we have some more grenadiers. There are still other examples that I could share too, but I think you get the point by now. There's ample pictorial evidence to suggest that the practice of wearing the cartridge pouch over the bayonet belt was fairly common, or at the very least, common enough that several notable artists who were alive during this time period could see it for themselves and chose to incorporate it into their works. I've been careful only to select contemporary illustrations, specifically to minimize the possibility of artist error. A majority of these scenes depicted in these illustrations are ones that the artist was actually present for, so the Warley Camp scenes by Latherborg, for instance. Latherborg was actually there, sketching that grenadier in real time, presumably, and not drawing from memory several years down the line where his recollection could be skewed by time. But while this practice of wearing the pouch over the bayonet definitely seems to have been common, judging from these illustrations, it certainly was not ubiquitous. There are plenty of other illustrations that depict the accoutrements being worn in the more traditional style of the bayonet being worn over the cartridge pouch and not under. The first one I am going to share is, curiously, another Latherborg sketch, this time of a battalion company man facing to the front with his musket at the recover. You can clearly see that his accoutrements are being worn in the more familiar configuration. Next is a sentinel on the palace's gangway, 1775, by Gabriel Bray, depicting supposedly a member of His Majesty's Marines, although the lace pattern on the man's sleeves is not consistent with the pattern typically seen on Marines during this period, so it could just be a soldier from some other regiment on sentry duty who just so happens to be on a ship. This is once again a view from the back, so we can see the configuration of his belting quite easily. Interesting side note here is the fact that the man's musket has barrel bands, which is a feature typically not found on British service muskets during this time period, so I'm not sure what's going on there. But that's besides the point. Up until this point, all of the images that I have shared have been either of grenadiers or battalion men, but these next few images that I am going to share are of light infantry troops. Here we have an officer of the 46th Foot and an officer of the 10th Foot. Next up, a close-up from Xavier Delegata's depiction of the Battle of Germantown, showing Corporal George Peacock carrying a wounded Richard St. George from the battlefield. This one is especially interesting because it was made in 1782, while the battle took place in 1777, and Delegata, an Italian artist, was not actually present for it. But Richard St. George, the wounded officer being depicted in the painting, actually worked with Delegata and provided eyewitness details for not only this painting, but also his other painting depicting the Battle of Paoli, both of which show the light company of the 40th Foot in action. So it is thought to be one of the more faithful depictions of the battle, and with Corporal Peacock in the foreground, we can see pretty clearly that he is shown with his bayonet being worn over his cartridge pouch. And again, here we have some more rank-and-file lights, and another Latherborg sketch. And finally, another angle on the mock attack, which shows a group of light infantry troops advancing while an officer rallies them. It's a little hard to make out the configuration of their belts considering the direction that most of them are facing, but the one man just right of center appears, to me at least, to be wearing his belting with the bayonet on top. The officer holding the fusee does not appear to be wearing a cartridge pouch at all, but rather a small shot bag of some kind. But he does appear to be wearing a bayonet as well, and it is on over the bag. And for contrast, if we look to the right of the frame, we can see some grenadiers advancing with muskets at the recover with bayonets fixed, and they seem to be wearing their pouches in the same way that is consistent with all of the other illustrations we have looked at which have portrayed grenadiers, which is to say, they're wearing their pouches over the bayonet belt. So this is probably the most interesting piece out of all of the ones that I've shared because it shows both configurations at the same time. You get the idea. There's ample evidence of soldiers wearing their belts in either configuration, but most of the evidence seems to suggest that the practice was largely limited to grenadiers and battalion companies, and perhaps not so much the light infantry. But even then, the practice does not seem to have been universal. The question is, why? Well, that's a little harder to answer, and unfortunately I can only offer speculation, something that usually I try my best to avoid, but in this case, nobody that I have spoken to on the matter has been able to offer anything concrete one way or the other. In the case of grenadiers, it's easy to deduce why they might prefer to wear the pouch over the bayonet, and I think it comes down to the equipment that the grenadiers carry. If we look at the Latherborg sketches and the Chiesa painting, we can see that in both of those, the grenadiers are wearing match cases, brass cylinders that would traditionally contain a piece of slow-burning cord, which would be used to light the fuses on grenades, back when grenadiers actually carried grenades. But by this period, they no longer do, and the match cases are simply a vestigial reminder of their former role. But as you can see, they're rather bulky and they take up a great deal of space on the belt. So it would make sense in their case for the pouch to be worn over the bayonet belt so as to not get it snagged when taking the belt on and off. But that doesn't account for why you see so many battalion company men wearing their belts in the same manner, since battalion men don't carry match cases. Normally, this is the point where I would consult the almighty Cuthbertson, and I will do so today again as well, but unfortunately, this is one of those situations where Cuthbertson isn't really all that helpful. He does talk extensively about cartridge pouches and bayonet belts, but offers no real suggestions as to which order the belts are supposed to be put on. In Chapter 4, Article 15 of his book, he says the following: "A non-commissioned officer, drummer, fifer, or private man should never appear abroad without having his sword or bayonet properly fixed in his belt, nothing being more unsoldier-like than seeing him without it, or carrying it in his hand on the pretense of saving the belt, a consideration surely of little weight with a colonel who wishes to see his regiment rise in the opinion of the public. A soldier without his sidearms, when walking through a town, is at once reduced to a level with the vilest plebeian, and deprived of that which gives him an air of consequence, not only in his own opinion, but likewise in that of the common people, who are principally caught by outside show." So basically what Cuthbertson is saying here is that the bayonet should be worn at all times, because to appear on duty without it gives an unsoldier-like appearance. At first glance, this would seem to support the notion that the bayonet is to be worn under the cartridge pouch and not over, because while a soldier may be on duty frequently, that does not necessarily mean that they will always be under arms. And if they're not under arms, then there is no reason for them to be wearing the cartridge pouch, whereas they are obliged to keep the bayonet on them at all times. So putting the bayonet on first and then putting the cartridge pouch on over it allows you to take the cartridge pouch back off again without having to first remove the bayonet, only to put it back on afterwards. Makes sense, right? But you have to keep in mind that at the time when Cuthbertson was writing this in 1768, the norm at this point was for soldiers to be wearing their bayonets around the waist and not over the shoulder. He does suggest transitioning over to a shoulder carriage, but it seems to have taken at least a few years for regiments to start implementing this suggestion. The Giuseppe Chiesa painting, which I showed earlier, is from 1771, if you recall. So maintaining a soldier-like appearance might be a reason to put the bayonet on first, but I would hesitate to say definitively that it is the reason. You also have to remember that Cuthbertson, although I like to cite him a lot in my videos, isn't really the be-all end-all on these matters. As reenactors, we often fall back to him a lot because we don't have anything better to cite a lot of the time. But the fact of the matter is that his writings are really just his suggestions to the army based on his own personal preferences and ideas, and the army doesn't always follow his suggestions. So just because Cuthbertson says that something should be done a certain way doesn't always mean that it was. And none of this explains why there's so little consistency. Why do we see some battalion men wearing their bayonets over while some are wearing them under? And what about the light infantry? Why do they seem to prefer wearing their bayonets over the pouches? Again, I don't know. It's really not clear. Although I admit to being somewhat ignorant of the way that the light infantry did things. So if anybody has any ideas, feel free to drop them in the comments below. But just how extensive was the practice of wearing the pouch over the bayonet, really? And who dictated when it was implemented and when it wasn't? Was it a regimental thing determined by the discretion of the colonel? And if it was determined by a colonel, why do we not have some written record of it somewhere? Was it a matter of personal preference? Again, none of that is clear. I know things have a tendency to get lost or destroyed over time, and so a lot of records that may have been able to shed some light on the topic could have possibly been forgotten about. Maybe there's some document languishing in a private collection somewhere that nobody knows about. Or maybe the answer is just sitting right under my nose and I just haven't found it yet. Maybe I'm just overthinking all of this. But this is one of those things that makes studying the 18th century so frustrating. Having to rely on hand-drawn illustrations rather than photographs can be a colossal headache at times, because you have to consider all of these things like when the illustration was made, who made it and why, What was the intent of the artist, and can it be reasonably assumed that they were striving for accuracy in their depiction? In the case of the illustrations I have shared with you today, I believe the answer to that question is yes, because the material culture of the period is otherwise very faithfully represented in all of them. So I don't know what the artists would gain by going to all the trouble of getting every other detail right, only to drop the ball when it comes to the order of the belts. So in summary, as far as 18th century British reenactors should be concerned, there are two possible configurations for belting. Both appear to be extensively documented, and neither one, in my opinion, appears to be any more or less correct than the other. I would, however, suggest that if you are portraying a grenadier or a battalion man, you may want to at least consider wearing your cartridge pouch over your bayonet belt if you're not already doing so. At the very least, it provides an interesting talking point. Anyway, that's all I had for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed, as usual. I think these topics are starting to get more and more niche as time goes on, so leave a like and a comment below if you enjoyed. Let me know. Subscribe if you haven't done so already. Ring that bell, as the cool kids like to say. And, as always, God save the king.